Good evening, all. Welcome to the INA session on Lifecycle GHG intensity of marine fuels. For today, we have the chief guest, Mr. Chamarthy P.K. Kashyap, Executive Director Operations of Sanmar Shipping, and the session chair, Professor Opisha, Emeritus Professor of IIT Kharagpur. And today's presenter is a very experienced naval architect among us, Mr. N. Girish, Senior Vice President Development of Indian Register of Shipping. It's my privilege to introduce the session chair of the day, Professor Opisha. He has sent me a very short resume, which I'll read. As the experience gets longer, probably the resumes get shorter. Professor Emeritus, Professor Opisha is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Ocean Engineering and Naval Architecture at IIT Kharagpur. He teaches a wide variety of subjects, and his areas of interest include ship design and production, CAD/CAM, and high-performance vehicles. He has been involved in a number of sponsored research and industrial consultancy projects. The most recent one being entrusted with the Sagarmala Cell, Ministry of Shipping, and IIT Kharagpur to head the Center for Inland and Coastal Maritime Technology at IIT Kharagpur, where the country's first shallow and deep water sea keeping and maneuvering basin for ship model testing is being set up. With this very brief introduction of the session chair, I would hand over the session to Professor Opisha. Please.
Thank you, Bharadwaj, for those kind words. It's a great pleasure to me, and it's an honor also. First of all, to introduce the chief guest for this particular session, Mr. C.P.K. Kashyap. He's a marine engineer by profession. He has a graduate degree in mechanical engineering from Andhra University and a master's degree in business administration from the University of Melbourne. Mr. Kashyap is presently the Executive Director, Operations with Sanmar Shipping, a Chennai-based firm, ship-owning company, and in charge of the operations of the company's fleet of ships, overseeing technical, human resources, HSE, and compliance functions. Prior to his assignment at Sanmar Shipping, Mr. Kashyap was the Resident Director for Bureau Emeritus, Sri Lanka, Managing Director in Marine, Industrial Quality and Environmental Compliance, Social Accountability, and Corporate Social Responsibility Verification. Mr. Kashyap has been with the industry for over 40 years, which also includes a sailing career of over 13 years. Apart from the above, Mr. Kashyap has been an active member in various technical committees of the classification societies and the shadow committee associated with the industry. He has been a part of the Indian delegation at the IMO for the MEPC, ISW Greenhouse Gas, Intersessional Working Group Greenhouse Gas meetings since 2017. And I can assure you that in all these meetings, Mr. Kashyap has been very active, and he has ensured that the country's interests at these meetings are kept foremost when deliberation and discussions are held. His intervention in all these meetings have been extremely useful, not only for the marine community, but particularly for the country in particular. So, welcome, Mr. Kashyap, to this particular session. It's again a great honor to introduce the speaker. There cannot be a more knowledgeable speaker than Mr. N. Girish. A brief introduction of Mr. Girish. He graduated in Naval Architecture and Shipbuilding from QSAT in 1982 and subsequently did his post-graduation in Ocean Engineering from Yokohama National University of Japan. He has worked in the ship design offices of Mazagon Dock for about 6 years prior to joining Indian Register of Shipping in 1991. He has been with IRS for the past 33 years, working in various capacities, but currently mainly involved in the rule development and research. He is the Senior Vice President, and the Chief Surveyor at IRS in charge of Rule Development, Associated Research, and External Affairs Division. Mr. Girish has an added burden because he has been associated with activities of IACS, IMO, and the Asian Association of Asian Classification Society. He has also been a part of the Indian delegation to IMO for the MEPC and ISW GHG emissions, where his papers and his deliberations have been of very good, been of importance, I would say, to the uh, MEPC committee. So, with these few words, I would request Mr. Girish to give his talk today.
Thank you, sir, for the kind introduction. I'll share my screen. I hope you can see the screen now.
Yes, sir, we can see it.
Yeah, thank you. So today's discussion is on life cycle GHG intensity of marine fuels. This is, of course, the life cycle analysis has been a topic in other industry also, in other fields, but now it is coming into our marine fuels field also. Now, this talk will be briefly covering the GHG LCA guidelines of IMO, which covers introduction, methodology, default emission factors, verification and certification of these factors, and review of the guidelines and further work required for implementation. Currently the maritime industry is pursuing this, the new target set by IMO, in the IMO strategy, GHG strategy, which aims to achieve net zero emissions by around 2050. To achieve this, one of the main method is to gradually change over to the alternative fuels other than the present fuels, so that GHG emissions will reduce so as to combat the climate change. So today we are hearing about biofuels, methanol, hydrogen, ammonia, and which includes the electrofuels also, which are synthetic fuels. These are all being considered for reducing emissions. But while we consider all these fuels, we have to ensure that the real life cycle overall GHG emissions of the fuel, that is considered right from emissions right from their production process, their transportation, bunkering, and finally the combustion or the other energy transfer on board. So entire life cycle of the fuel should be considered, so that these new fuels are having lower life cycle GHG emissions compared to the fossil fuels. Otherwise, they are not useful. So it is necessary to verify that the life cycle GHG emissions, GHG intensity of the marine fuels before you accept them on board. So the IMO MEPC 81 in March 2024 has adopted the 2024 guidelines on life cycle GHG intensity of marine fuels. So also known as the 2024 LCA guideline. LCA stands for life cycle assessment or life cycle analysis. So we will briefly see what is in these guidelines. Now this is what we have been talking about. We have the life cycle concept here. The first, the top, the blue colored row that gives for a renewable fuel system what happens, and the bottom one for the fossil fuel system. Let us look at the fossil fuel system, that which we are more familiar. So the extraction and processing takes place first from the either offshore or onshore, and while you do this extraction processing, some greenhouse gases and pollutants come out of this in the process that is being emitted. Then it is transported either by pipelines and then trucks and ships and all. And that time also fuel is consumed for transportation. Again, from that fuel, some GHG emission comes out. Then it reaches a conversion site like a refinery where the crude oil is refined. And that time, a lot of energy is required and chemicals are required for this process. So there again, due to this energy, some GHG emissions come out. And this may include carbon capture. This carbon capture may help in reducing this slightly because we absorb the carbon dioxide and stop it going into the atmosphere. That we will see later. Then we have the transportation and distribution of the fuel from the refinery to the wherever sources it is. It can be on the ship also. Finally, it reaches the end user. So end user also will have while there's combustion or usage of the fuel, there will be again GHG emissions. So each of the steps will have GHG emissions. So life cycle emissions will include the entire cycle. Similarly, if you look at the other kind of the renewable fuels, you may have biomass, or if it is biologically based fuels or biofuels, then you may have maybe captured carbon or electricity, renewable electricity, all that can be used for this production. So there's a feedstock is being produced. And while we produce a feedstock, some greenhouse gases and air pollutants will be released into the atmosphere. Then again, we transport it to a pre-processing site and then to a conversion site. So all this process involves GHG emissions from fuel and energy and chemicals and all that. And finally, fuel transportation, distribution, and end user. So the distribution and user phase also will have the GHG emissions. So this is again, here the only difference is that there may be some more processes in the case of the renewable fuel system. So which means that we have to be more careful about the renewable fuel system to see that it doesn't exceed the renewable fuel overall GHG emission should not exceed the fossil fuel system. Otherwise, there's no point in going into the renewable fuel system. That is what the main reason why we need this LCA guidelines. So this is a similar slide, more or less similar thing depicted here: production, conversion, transportation, distribution, storage, bunkering, and propulsion. You can see that what we call as well to tank ends up to bunkering, and then tank to wake starts. That is in the ship. But the ship what is emitting is a tank to wake. Of course, the life cycle stages are given in the guidelines in this form. That also describes it in the same way. That the well to tank and then tank to wake. Well to tank is up to end of the bunkering until it reaches the vessel. So we have feedstock extraction, cultivation, early processing of the feedstock, transportation, conversion to product fuel, and the product fuel is transported, stored or delivered, retailed, and all that happens. So each of the process will have some emissions. Finally, it is bunkering. Bunkering process takes place onto the ship, and it is combustion or conversion in a ship. Energy is converted. There is an energy converter. It can be an engine or fuel cell or whatever means of conversion of energy. So that's where the tank to wake takes place. So until bunkering or including bunkering will be the well to tank. So we will be using these words well to tank and tank to wake very often in these guidelines in the presentation also. So normally they're known as WTT and TTW. Now we talk earlier. We have been talking only about carbon dioxide. We have been trying to control carbon dioxide emissions, but now it is realized that while we go for other fuels, we have to consider other greenhouse gases also. So in these guidelines, mainly we consider carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Why methane and nitrous oxide? Because they are got higher global warming potential compared to that of carbon dioxide. For example, if you take in this table, we can see carbon dioxide, if it is 1 for a global warming potential for 100 years, then methane will be 28 times and nitrous oxide will be 265 times. So the same compared to that of carbon dioxide for the same mass of the carbon dioxide. Similarly, if you take for 20 years, you will find that the CH4 or the methane emissions, methane global warming potential is higher for 20 years. Later on, it comes down to 28. But in these guidelines, generally, we are using the 100-year as a standard. When the GWP20 is also to be calculated for reference purposes, but 100 will be used for our evaluation. And the global warming potential 100. So when you work out the gram CO2 equivalent So we convert the nitrous, the N2O, nitrous oxide, and methane into an equivalent carbon dioxide emission. So that is a G, and in this equation, it is given by gram CO2 equivalent will be given by 1 into gram CO2 of CO2 plus 28 times that of the CH4 and 265 times that of the N2O. So adding all this, you will get the equivalent, the gram carbon dioxide equivalent corresponding to 100 years. Similarly, you can calculate for 20 years also. So this is the concept used for finding out the CO2 equivalent emission in the guidelines. And there are one or two small formula or equations which we may have to understand a bit, because we can't avoid when we talk about the guidelines. One is now we come to the methodology, how the guidelines are using it. So we have the well to tank, how to calculate well to tank emissions, and then tank to wake emissions. Firstly, we see the well to tank. So there's the formula GHG well to tank, WTT, the GHG emissions. So the unit of this is gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule for the LCV of the fuel, based on the LCV of the fuel. So why it's megajoule? Because if you take different fuels will have a different LCV, the calorific value. So accordingly, they give different energy. So we can't take it on the basis of the weight of the fuel. Gram per gram cannot be used because it may vary. So we have to go by gram per megajoule. So gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule is the unit used. And briefly, these guidelines have adopted this kind of a formula. This is based on, this is also used in IPCC and other discussion forums. So this is EFECU plus EL, EP, ETD minus ESCA and minus ECCS. The minus are credit values, which we'll see what are those. Firstly, EFECU is the emission associated with the feedstock extraction, cultivation, acquisition, recovery. Then EL, there is something called EL, that's emissions from carbon stock changes caused by direct land use change. There is something called land use change, which is with the agricultural people, they know it well, but for us, it's a new concept for the marine people. So we should understand it a bit, because when you change, supposing you cut a forest and then plant some trees for making biofuel, for example, for producing biofuel. So we are actually changing the carbon stock in the soil. So that means, in fact, we are adding to the emission, because we have removed so much of carbon stock with the trees which are already there. So while we do this land use change, when you change the land use, there will be emissions. So that is the concept of EL, the emissions for land use change. And it is annualized for over 20 years, because 20 years taken as a standard for the growth of plants and all that. So it is annualized for over 20 years. Then EP is what we can understand. It is the emission associated with the feedstock processing, transformation. We already seen that emission, and associated with the conversion of the feedstock into the final fuel, including electricity generation. So all those all the emissions associated with that is there in EP. Then ETD is the transportation and distribution. That means we have seen the previous slides. We transport and distribute the fuel. And there are two minus values here. One, that is, we are getting some credit. One is emission credit from soil carbon accumulation via improved agricultural management. So this can be proven if we can work out that by doing proper crop rotation and other kind of agricultural management, you are able to improve the carbon stock in the soil. In that case, improve the soil carbon accumulation. That means we are actually reducing the emission. Then another one is ECCS, that is emission credit from carbon capture and storage, that have not already been accounted in the EP. EP is for production. So you may capture the carbon and store it while you are producing the fuel. So that is again, you are reducing the carbon from going out. So we get a credit for that is ECCS. Of course, this is briefly the formula, but to calculate each of these items, we need very good data and information. Otherwise, it's not easy to work out this GHG WTT. Now, that is about well to tank. That is until the fuel reaches the ship. So far, we have never been concerned about this, because we have been taking the fuel. Also, the regulations that IMO only tank to wake. What is happening on board the ship only we consider. We don't bother about what is happening on land. But now, in the life cycle emission, we have to think about what is happening during the production of the fuel also. Now, we talked about the land use change, a little bit about land use change, so that you get a better understanding. The land use change can be two types, direct and indirect. For the production of for the production of biofuels mainly due to land use change, LUC, and LUC can be classified as LUC, DLUC and indirect LUC, that ILUC. So DLUC and ILUC are very commonly used words in this area. And DLUC definition is described as a change in the use or management of land within the product system being assessed. That means we are using some land for cultivating a crop, which from that we directly process and get the biofuel, let us say corn or any other product, or or maybe palm oil or whatever you are cultivating. And when the land is used for that purpose, there is a direct land use change. And the direct land use impacts comprises the emissions and sequestration resulting from carbon stock changes in biomass, dead organic matter, and soil organic matter. So if any of these changes in the soil, like biomass in the soil or organic matter or soil organic matters, that will change the carbon stock. And there is a direct land use change effect on the emissions. The ILUC is an indirect land use change, but it's a consequence of the direct land use change, but which occurs outside the product system being assessed. I mean, supposing we use some area which is already used for some feedstock cultivation, like corn or palm oil, which is used as a feedstock. It is sorry, for a food crop. Let's say it is a food crop, and suddenly we change that for the purpose of biofuel production. So there will be effect on the price of the food crop or food because of this. So this is the indirect effect. And ILUC occurs as a result of economic impacts induced by increased biofuel demand on primary food and feed production. So then you are actually competing with the food and then displacing the food production by making biofuel. So that the economic impacts is in the another area. It's not in the direct, I would say, in the product being assessed. It's not in the oil product being assessed, but in a different product. So that's why it's called ILUC. It's more difficult to evaluate. I would say quantitatively, it is more difficult to evaluate ILUC. So they use economic models, but sometimes we use kind of a risk-based models also. ILUC cannot be directly measured, so it's projected with economic models. While we do that, in these guidelines we are generally considering it by a risk-based approach, where low ILUC risk and high ILUC risk has been defined. Low ILUC risk means it characterizes biofuel production projects that supply additional feedstock without disrupting existing land uses. So without disrupting the existing usage for food and other crops, we produce that has got low risk. Whereas high means you are actually there are projects which displaces food and feed crops, resulting in significant expansion of the feedstock production area, shifting into land with high carbon stock. Or maybe you cut some forests and then start producing some of this feedstock. Then also there's a high risk, high ILUC risk involved. So the practices of low and high ILUC risks are to be taken into account while we certify these fuels. So now there is one more equation which is a little more complicated, but we are more familiar with this because this is tank to wake. As marine people, we are more familiar with tank to wake, what is happening on board my ship. So this calculation is GHG tank to wake, and the main components here are, one is CFCO2. We know about the CO2 emission conversion factor for the combustion of the fuel, and that multiplied by the global warming potential of CO2, and CH4, while some methane also will be emitted while there is a combustion of fuel. So that will have some effect on the global warming potential. And N2O, any nitrous oxide being emitted in the combustion process, that is multiplied by GWP N2O. So if you multiply these GWP values we have seen earlier, maybe 1 for carbon dioxide, 28 times, and 264 times for NTO and the nitrous oxide. So this much part will give you what is happening in the combustion and what is coming out and creating a global warming potential. Now there are other things also which are happening. The other one is that there's a sea slip ship. That is sea slip means is a factor according to the fuel which escapes from the energy converter without being oxidized. Then what happens generally is more important for the methane emissions, because when you have natural gas fuel, LNG fuel vessels, so methane, because of the slip, some methane may go out of the engine without being oxidized or without being converted. So that will directly give a global warming potential effect. So we have to consider how much is the slip coming from the engine. And there are the sea fugitive emissions. Fugitive means this is happening from the tank to the engine. That is factor accounting for the fuel, which escapes between the tanks up to the energy converter. That is the engine, which is leaked, vented, or otherwise lost in the system. So that's the fugitive emission. So there's a fugitive emission and say slip, the slip emission. This is very important especially for the LNG fuel vessels, where methane has got very large effect on this. So since we are multiplying the whatever being the combustion part we are considering here, we minus that 1 minus 1 by 100 into C slip plus C fuge. The C slip and C fuge is taken out of it, but that is not being combusted, and that's why we do 1 minus 1 by 100 of this. And then this, whatever we are removed from here, we are separately consider 1 by 100 into C slip plus C fugitive, because these are given in the form of percentages, 3%, 1.5%, like that. These are the slip values that multiplied by the fuel factor and the global warming potential for that emission fuel. So this is separately the slip and the fugitive emission fuels part is separately calculated. And that is added to the combustion part. Then we have some credit where we get some minus terms which will reduce our emissions. One is EC, emission credit due to biomass growth. Like if you use a biofuel, what really happens is that the biofuel, the tree is absorbing the carbon from the atmosphere. Sequestration, what is going to take place, and then that is what we are burning. So when you burn the biofuel, in fact, this carbon dioxide which comes out by burning the biofuel is actually absorbed by the trees. So we get an advantage there. There is an emission credit due to biomass growth. The biomass, from the biomass growth, we are producing the fuel. So that emission credit can be minus here. Then we have another CCU. CCU is the emission credit from the use captured CO2 as carbon stock to produce synthetic fuels in the fuel production process and utilization. That means while you produce a fuel, if you capture the carbon dioxide and use it for producing fuels, other fuels, so then there also we can get a credit. And the other credit is EOCCS, that is emission credit from carbon capture and storage, where capture of CO2 occurs on board. So the first one is ECCU is for the production. During the production of fuel, you have some credit if you capture the carbon. Second one is if you capture the carbon on board the ship. We have got carbon capture systems being installed on board the ship. So such systems will give you credit for and that is called onboard carbon capture and storage, that is EOCCS. So these two are minused, and there are some factor SFC and CCU. These are factors because sometimes, I mean, this can be either 0 or 1. Sometimes this credit we don't consider it here. Sometimes the credit is considered in the well to tanks stage itself. That means in some of the countries, their national inventories, they consider in the production of fuel itself, they take into account this credit. So in that case, we can't again do the other become double counting. So in such cases, we cannot use this credit here. Otherwise, we can use it one and we can use the credit here. That is why these two factors, SFC and CCU, are under. So broadly, we have the combustion, whatever emissions from combustion, and the emissions from the fugitive emissions in the slip, and these credits due to carbon emission credit biomass growth and carbon capture. This is broadly the equation, and again this is given in the form of the unit is gram CO2 equivalent per megajoule. Then we have the tank to wake, the onboard carbon capture. The onboard, we talked about EOCCS, the onboard carbon capture. So that is not very simple because there again, suppose I capture carbon so I got a big system for capturing carbon on the ship, and we capture the carbon dioxide, and that requires a lot of energy, a lot of chemical processes involved in capturing and then converting and all that. So all that energy what is consumed will have to minus. Then otherwise you'll be giving more credit for the carbon dioxide. So we have to CSC, like CSC is a credit equivalent to CO2 captured. So out of the credit, we reduce the credit due to any emission associated with the process of capturing, compression, and temporarily stored on board the ship. And transportation, taking into emission associated with the process of storing and emission associated with the onboard carbon capture and storage. Any additional emission. So here, there has been some opinions at IMO that the ship, the person who's operating the ship will know only up to the point where he captures the carbon dioxide and gives it to a port, wherever to a collection point. Beyond that, what he does, we don't have any control. So that should be taken separately. So that is still that will be under consideration. But otherwise, EOCCS as of now in the guidelines, it will be considering that also. That means total this credit what is given, you have to minus all the other factors, and the emission due to the process of capturing and the transportation and storage and all that. So this is EOCCS, just to understand what because we are using it in the previous, you would have seen in the previous slide that we have used this EOCCS is taken out of this total GHG emission from tank to wake. Now we come to a different topic. So this now so far we have seen the GHG emissions, how to work out the GHG emissions, tank to wake and well to wake. Well to tank and tank to wake. Now summation of well to tank and tank to wake will be the well to wake. That's what we are interested in, the total life cycle emission. Now there are other aspects also we have to consider when you produce such fuels. So this is sustainability. So we have to think about the sustainability of these fuels. Otherwise, we cannot be producing some fuel which is not sustainable. So there are a lot of aspects which are defined in the guidelines to be considered, and which should be, and the fuel should be certified to be complying with these aspects, and some kind of a it's not a real criteria, but that it is some type of a criteria it meets. That's what the guidelines give. So firstly, it is greenhouse gases. We have already seen that the greenhouse gases should not be more than the fossil fuel. So sustainable marine fuel generate lower GHG emissions than conventional marine fuels. So that has to be checked. Energy-based weighted average of liquid petroleum products on 3 specific years of DCS data. It's a purpose of IMO DCS. They take 3 years of data, and then from that we can find energy weighted average of the petroleum products, how much it is being consumed now, or how much is being emitted now. And then the sustainable marine fuel should emit less than the current fossil fuels on a life cycle basis. That is the first one. That we can work out from what we have done so far. And then the carbon source, where the carbon source should not come from fossil fuels. It can come, but it should not increase the GHG intensity. Sustainable marine fuels do not increase GHG intensity from the use of fossil energy sources. So for that, we have a carbon source indicator and the percentage of carbon in it, and the origin of the feedstock is also to be indicated. Then source of electricity or energy. So for producing these fuels, we use a lot of electricity and energy. And this source should be from renewable sources, because again, if you're using fossil fuel, then it is no point. Again, we are increasing the fossil GHG intensity. Sustainable marine fuels requiring significant electricity input during the well to tank phase, that is when you are producing it. And electricity delivered directly to ships are produced by using electricity energy from renewable, nuclear, or biogenic sources, which are additional to the current or long-standing demand levels. So already we have a demand, so it should be additional to that. That much you should produce for renewables. Then only it can be credited. Then carbon stock or direct land use change. This is we talked about the land use change quite a bit in the beginning. So the sustainable marine fuels are not made from biomass obtained from land with high carbon stock, that means like forests or any other that kind of land. Production of sustainable marine fuels minimizes emissions resulting from direct land use change. Then we have the indirect land use change. We also briefly touched upon. Cultivation of feedstock of sustainable marine fuels minimizes inducing negative changes in the use or management of land, which occurs outside the product system being assessed. But we said this means that if when you change the land usage for the purpose of cultivating feedstock, you should not displace other negative effect on the food and other items. Then water, of course, it is quite obvious. Production of sustainable marine fuels maintain or enhance water quality and availability. Similarly, air air production of sustainable fuels minimizes negative impact on air quality, and the soil health also is another factor. Then waste and chemicals, if there are sustainable, while you produce sustainable fuels, if there is a waste and chemicals are being produced, so they should maintain or enhance the responsible management of waste and use of chemicals. Then we have conservation, production of sustainable fuels, maintain or enhance biodiversity and ecosystems, or conservation services. So these are the 10 items will be checked, will have to be verified for sustainability of the fuel. So that was about sustainability. Now, okay, we did all that. Now we need some kind of a certificate, some kind of an indicator showing that the fuel which I'm getting is meeting all these requirements. Now, for that, there is something called as fuel life cycle label, FLL, which these guidelines are devised a label, and this label consists of 5 parts. So basically, this label is a technical tool to collect and convey the information relevant for the life cycle assessment of marine fuels and energy carriers also. That is, energy carrier can be other energy carrier, can be electricity for shore power given to ships. There also we have to see that it is based on sustainability basis and used for ship propulsion and power generation only. So the 5 parts of the FLL, the part A, first is part A, which indicates general details of fuel and the well to tank GHG emission factor. We can see the part A is divided into 5 parts, part A1, A2, A3, A4, and A5. The first 4 are various general particulars like fuel type, pathway code. Pathway code, we will see it's given in these guidelines, lower calorific value, and share in the fuel blend, in case there's a blend. And part A5 is an important point, well to tank GHG emission factor, BWP 100 grams CO2 equivalent per mj. So here, well to tank is given. That means in part A, we get the well to tank value, whatever we have seen, the production, whatever is in the production, transportation and distribution area. So all that well to tank emission factor will be given in this level, in part A of the level. Then the second level is part B. Second part is part B of the FLL, which indicates carbon credits related to carbon sources. We talked about carbon credits quite a bit. Emission credits, part B1 and B2, emission credits related to biogenic carbon source. That we talked about EC. If you there's a credit, you are getting credit for using certain biofuels or the biomass for producing the fuel. So we get carbon credit for that. That is EC value. Then carbon credit due to carbon CCU, that is captured carbon. Carbon dioxide we capture during the production process. So these 2 values are given in part B1 and B2. These are the credits, which will be used later on when we can minus it from the tank to wake emissions. And then we have the part C, which is basically tank to wake emission, GHG emissions, and the energy converter also is specified for a particular energy converter type. For a particular engine type, we may have the tank to wake GHG emissions. As we discussed earlier, the tank to wake GHG emissions are given in 2 types. The first one is without considering the carbon source. That means this is if you just calculate without giving any credit to the I would say for the carbon source, we just calculate the tank to wake emissions. Other one is part C2, where we consider the carbon source. The carbon credit is considered, that we saw the value of SF1 and 0. In one case, we consider it at the tank to wake stage and we give credit for that. Other case, we don't give credit because the credit must have been given earlier in the well to tank stage. Normally, we have this part C2. C2 is the normally used factor where you give credit to the biofuels for the biomass, I would say the credit to the biomass growth. So we have part C, and that's for the tank to wake, and then we have part D, which is the well to wake GHG emission factor. There we have the sum of the two, sum of the part A5 and part C2, where we are using part 2. C2, it can be C1 also, but C2 plus A5. A5 is, we have seen that the tank to well to tank value, and part C2 is a tank to wake value. So if you add the two, you get the well to wake. That is given in part D. And part E is part E is for the sustainability performance. These are all the aspects for sustainability, and which is this is fuel is certified for sustainability. So that such a sustainability performance of the fuel is indicated in part E. Right. So different parts are used by different parties. They different parties, like you got fuel supplier, owner, operator, administration, RO, etc. So fuel supplier may look at only from well to tank, whatever is happening. The part A look at, whereas the owner operator may look at the entire thing. Administration RO will look at the whole thing, and the owner also may focus will be more on the tank to wake, because we get, when you buy the fuel, you get the well to tank value already. So we have to focus on, the owner will focus on the tank to wake, what are the emissions. Finally, the combined thing will be seen and then be certified. So different part of the FL along the fuel pathway is relevant to their activities will be seen by different parties. So that is about the fuel life cycle level, which gives, it's a tool for indicating what is the life cycle emission of the fuel. Now coming to default emission factors, because now we talked about all these calculations and all these values. Unless we have data on all this, how much GHG emissions have taken place during the production of the fuel, or what happens during maybe fugitive emissions, or what happens on board, all that we should know. Without that, you won't be able to calculate this the overall well to wake emissions. So some default emission factors have been collected, and the guideline gives how to the guidance on how to collect these principles and procedures, I would say, for evaluation of default emission factors. So they use generally, it should be representative and conservative assumptions, which encompasses variable performance of feedstock fuel pathways across world regions and states. So presently the guideline gives you take a worldly in the entire world performance and then take the most conservative value. Whereas there are different opinions on this. So sometimes they may have a regional value which is better, which is lower, gives the lower emission than that of the global value. So there are still some discussion going on at IMO on this matter. But presently they consider the conservative value. And to establish a well-to-tank default emission factor, at least 3 reference values from 3 different sources should be considered. And among the 3, the upper emission value should be selected as default. So if you get 3 from 3 different sources and representative value, then the highest for the uppermost value will be taken as a default value. That's a conservative way of approach. And guidelines give table of default emission factors in the appendix. So there is a big table given in the guidelines, and this, however, this table is currently insufficient. I would say they don't have sufficient data in the table because we are still collecting data, and the data is also to be verified by expert before it will be put into the guidelines. So emissions related to the following requires further development. That is, we talked about the carbon stock changes, the DL, UC, EL, then the emissions from soil carbon accumulation, ESCA, and parameters related to carbon capture and storage. All these things will require further study and further development of the guidelines. And recently the guidelines were modified slightly by giving the IPCC and ISO 14067 based methodology for the evaluation of ESCA and EL, that is the soil carbon accumulation and land use change. They have, for this, they have given the guidelines have taken or adopted the methods given in IPCC and ISO 14067. Whereas the carbon factor for methane, nitrous oxide, and C-slip emission factors, they depend on the type of fuel, engine, and the engine load. Engine load also will vary, so that also will have to be considered. So in the case of existing fuels and existing engines, these factors can be obtained using the reference values given in the 4th IMO GHG study. But other fuels and engines, further workers need to establish measurement procedures. So these are all areas which are still not completely covered by these guidelines. Properly, I would say not properly covered, but further work is required. And another area is the fugitive emissions. They are difficult to measure. Fugitive emissions, what is happening from the tank to the energy converter. I mean, the whatever emissions come from pipelines and all that, and whatever leakages come from pipelines and all that. Like, for example, LNG, where LNG normally for this gas carriers, they have some assumptions on fugitive emissions. but they are very small compared to other GHG emissions. C fugitive, for the time being, they are set to 0, but after further review and study of various data, C fugitive values also will be given. So in the order of maybe 1 to 3% and things like that. So we just talked about this default emission factors. Now, the way it is given in the guideline, I will just introduce that some example is given. So firstly, there is a non-exhaustive list of fuels and production pathways. First thing what they did is they found out all the lists of the fuels which are possible fuels presently or later in future to be used on board, and their various production pathways. So when you add various production pathways, maybe renewable or maybe fossil based or all kinds of pathways of production of this fuel, there are 128 number of items here, depending on the fuel and the production pathways. So this the first one is an example for the VLSFO, the very low sulfur fuel oil, HFO. The heavy fuel oil grades are given, A217 grades, ISO A217 grades, RME, RMG, and RMK, where the sulfur content is 0.1 to up to 0.5. So the feedstock type is coming from crude oil, and nature of carbon sources, fossil fuel. And the process is standard refinery process. And energy uses electricity, that is grid mix electricity. Grid mix is what is available on the grid. Each country will have a grid, and the grid will have a mixture of electricity coming from maybe renewables or from fossil and all that. So that whatever mix is there for a country, that is being used for the production of the fuel. And the code has been given, HFO, VLSFO. F stands for fossil, SR standard refinery process, and GM in grid mix. So this is a code the guidelines are given. Like that, about 128 codes are given, various type of fuels. One or two more examples, like if you take LNG fuel, methane, natural gas from fossil, standard LNG production, including liquefaction, and grid mix electricity is being used. And this is the code for that. And if you take a biofuel, for example, FAME, fatty acid methyl ester, which is normally used biofuel, diesel FAME. It is it's taken from the second, when it is taken from the second generation feedstock, that means not from the first generation. I mean, maybe a used oil being used again, so that your carbon emissions will come down. Biogenic and transesterification is the process. Grid mix electricity is used. So this is a code for that. FAME, biogenic, transesterification, second generation, and grid mix electricity. So like that, about 128 codes are given. And now our point is to find out what is the default emission values for each of these codes. That's a very big job with IMO. They have not completed it, but they have whatever data they have got, they have collected. And some of the data which they are sure about it, they could verify their code, but it's not fully verified. Only the verified data what is published in the fourth IMO GHG study that they have put here. For example, if you take the first one, we talked earlier, the heavy fuel oil. Heavy fuel oil, the well-to-tank GHG intensity 16.8 grams CO2 per megajoule. This is only the well-to-tank. The tank-to-wake would be, even though it's not given here, tank-to-wake we can calculate because we have the LCV value. So when you burn that, you get, it comes to around, and the CFCO2 is also given here. CFCO2 gives you the gram CO2, so how many grams of carbon dioxide is coming out from 1 gram of fuel, per gram of fuel. So if so much of 3.114 gram is coming out of 1 gram of fuel, if you divide it by the LCV, you will get so much of carbon dioxide per mj. That is what we are looking at, per mj. That is the GHG intensity, gram CO2 per mj. So this divided by this will give you that. So that way, if you calculate, this works out to around 90. The total is around 76 plus, the total comes to around 90. That is 92 or something. That will be the well to wake value, the total well to wake value for HFO. Then N2O and methane and N2O, some very little amount of methane and nitrous oxide also is emitted when you burn this, when there is a combustion of these fuels. That is also identified here. Similarly, for liquefied natural gas, you can see that here the CFCO2 value is slightly less than that of the fuel, the HFO. So we get some reduction in the carbon dioxide emission in the case of LNG. But there is a slip, which 3.5% slip is there. So for that, you'll have to calculate what will be the emissions. So well to tank is coming to 19.8, certainly more than the well to tank in the case of OQLI. And with this 2.75, we can calculate what will be the tank to weight value. So these kind of figures, these kind of tables, gives you an entire range of spectrum of various default values for various types of fuels and pathways. Another thing for the diesel FAME, they are given only the well to tank value and LCV value, because we are not considering this other emissions here, because this is a second generation fuel. There is no, we don't consider what is happening in the carbon dioxide emission, because credit is given by the biomass growth. We are taken from biomass, so we don't consider CO2 here. So that is briefly about how it looks like in the guidelines, the default emission factors. A lot of work is yet to be done on default emission factors. Whatever they could collect in the last 1 year, they have collected from by the correspondence group, but still they could not verify it, and they needed experts to verify that before it is put into the guidelines finally. Now, these are the default emission factors. You can also allow actual emission factors if you find that the default values are higher than my real actual value. If you can prove that, it is possible to accept actual emission factors. So for that, you have to use the same guidelines and then calculate as per the methodology given in the guidelines. So well to tank and tank to weight emission factors will be based on the methodologies established in the guidelines. And there is one difference, is that in the case of fossil fuels, the default values are already given and they don't allow any actual values, because that is presently the guidelines do not allow actual values for the fossil fuel. The fossil fuel is some kind of average value has been put here, so they don't want to go for not really average, it's a conservative value, but since this is established value, they're not allowing any actual emission factor. But this has been contested. There have been some papers in the last MEPC that we should allow actual factor values. So this also may be taken, maybe discussed further. As of now, default values are only allowed for the fossil fuel. Now we come to another aspect, that is verification certification. We have already seen that the FLL, the fuel life cycle label, is there, which gives you the label gives you each carbon the GHG emission at each stage of the process of the pathway of the fuel. So this has to be verified and certified by somebody. That is very important. Otherwise, we can't use these values. So when used as evidence for performances, fuel, the FLL needs to be verified and certified by a third party, taking into account the further guidance to be developed. So this verification certification, the following parts of FLL may be carried out separately by different verification bodies. So you may have different verification bodies for different part of the pathway, like part A, well to tank emission, the production process can be done by one party. Part B, carbon credit can also be done by another party. And part C is the tank to wake. This can be done by a different party who is dealing with the ship. And party sustainability certification, another aspect of that, also can by a different party. And of the same third party can do the entire thing also, but normally it doesn't happen. Each party will have their expertise in the various fields. So verification of part D is to be based on verified part A, part B, and part C. Part D, the well to wake emissions, will be verified based on what we have got from well to tank and tank to wake, as well as the carbon credits. So these three together will only determine how much well to wake emissions is there. So unless part A, part B, and part C are available, we can't verify part D. And the default or actual emission factors may be used for part A5, that is well to tank, part C, tank to wake, and only part D. So default values or actual emission factors can be used. That we have already seen that. Now, and the certification schemes and standards also should be recognized by the committee. Committee means the MEPC. IMO should recognize the scheme. Only such schemes will be accepted. Guidance will be developed by IMO for certification. That's another remaining job to be done. And the list of recognized certification scheme standards should be publicly available and kept under review. And the framework, criteria, and procedures leading to the recognition of certification schemes should be implemented uniformly. So that is why it has to be recognized by IMO. There are many certification bodies already operating in various other sectors, also in marine sector. So this gives a list of various frameworks already available or already in place, which some of this can be adopted by IMO also. There are some mandatory requirements, the governmental statutory requirements in EU, California, and Brazil, like EU RED, Renewable Energy Directive, mainly used for biofuels. And then Fuel EU Maritime, you know about that. They are trying to reduce the GHG intensity of marine fuels. And then there are some voluntary schemes also, like ICAO, CORSIA. This is used by the airlines industry, which is accepted by ICAO. Aviation, they use this because they use the aviation fuel, which is mainly using biofuels. So for that, the biofuels which are used in aviation, they are certified as per this ICAO standard. Then the certification schemes, there are some schemes which are being made by certain independent bodies like the ISCC. ISCC scheme is very, very popular. That's a global scheme which covers all types of fuels. ISCC means International Sustainability and Carbon Certification. There's a kind of standard certification scheme made by this body. And their certification scheme can be used by everybody. But that is accepted by IMO also in one of the recent biofuel circular. They accept these kind of schemes. Then we also have there are two main certification schemes available: are Roundtable on Sustainable Biomaterials, mainly Europe called RSB and ISCC. So probably one of these will be accepted by IMO later on, recognized by IMO, which can be some other body can certify as per this scheme. And looking at if you look at all these various certification schemes and the mandatory and voluntary regulatory frameworks, this is a metric showing what all things it covers. So this is the sustainability themes aspects. We have seen GHG, carbon source, all those things are there. Water, air, LUC, DLUC. So which all schemes, like EU already covers all these the first 5 items, and some of the items, air, water, it doesn't cover. Whereas if you look at the RSB and the ISCC certificate scheme, they cover all these aspects which are covered in the IMO guidelines. So these are more suitable for the purpose of IMO now. And these are all applicable to marine fuels, partly at least. Some of the fuels are covered here. So these are the currently available certification scheme which IMO can possibly accept and recognize, and then accordingly certification can be done for the fuels. Now this LCA guidelines will need a review. So the guidelines also talk about something of how to review this. Guidelines should be kept under continuous technical review, taking into account emerging and evolving technologies, particularly the well-to-tank, tank-to-wake, and well-to-wake default emission factors, because that keeps default value also can change with the new technology. But today, what the default value for a synthetic fuel may tomorrow better processes and improvement will be there. It may change, it may reduce. And the new proposed fuel pathways and the corresponding default emission factors, in addition to those specified in the appendix. And the appendix already gives a complete full list of, we talked about 128 pathways. There could be new pathways coming up. That also will have to be added. So that's why this guidelines are to be kept under review. Now, the work on this guideline is not complete. So IMO has realized that, and even though MEPC has already adopted this 2024 guidelines, there is much more work to be done. So they have formed some correspondence groups and also expert group they are going to form. The first correspondence group will be on measurement and verification of non-CO2 GHG emissions, that is the methane and nitrous oxide emissions, and also on onboard carbon capture. So this correspondence group will work on how to consider the develop a framework for actual tank-to-wake methane emissions and nitrous oxide emissions factors, how to measure and verify, as well as the C-slip value for energy converter. C-slip is very important, how much methane slip is taking place in the engines. Then also a work plan on development of regulatory framework for the use of onboard carbon capture. Carbon capture is also picking up because that there are carbon capture systems available, even though they consume a lot of energy, still the regulatory framework is needed for approval of those carbon capture systems. So that also will be done by this correspondence group. Another correspondence group they are forming for the development of LCA framework, that is to further consider other social and economic sustainability themes and aspects of marine fuels. So we talked about mainly environmental considerations only in the case of sustainability. There can be other social and economic aspects also, which whether how to consider, whether how much to consider will be discussed by this correspondence group. And then we talked about the third one is the expert group. There is a system called GSAMP. GSAMP group is available in the UN. IMO uses the GSAMP. Basically, GSAMP means a group of experts on the scientific aspects of marine environmental protection. So a new working group, GSAMP LCA working group will be formed. That's what they're trying to form. This working group will evaluate. They are experts, group of experts who know the scientific aspects of this, all the fuels, and they will do a scientific review of the LCA methodology and the default, especially the default emission factors. Nobody has verified it properly, so they will verify this default emission factors and improve the sustainability aspects and metrics, ILU series classification, as well as provide information on development of fuel pathway and emission certification methodology. Certification we just talked about. Methodology for certification also will be seen by this GSAMP and CA working group to be established. So these are the future work to be done. So we have the guidelines and further work is required still. So we have broadly seen what is in the guidelines and how they calculate the well to tank and tank to wake emissions and sustainability, as well as the fuel life cycle label to give you indicate and how we have to verify and certify that. So that I come to the end of this presentation. Thank you for your kind attention.
One second.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you, Mr. Girish, for a comprehensive, wide-ranging, and a very beautiful presentation. I think these are things for the future, and things are not going to get any easier now, as I can see in the future, both for class and for the operators also at the same time, and the administrators. So I would first, before we start the question answer session, the first thing I would like to request Mr. CPK Kashyap, the chief guest for today, to give his views and his ideas, and also, if possible, to briefly tell us what are things that are going to come up in this particular area. So over to Mr. Kashyap.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you, Dr. Iyengar, for giving me this honor of attending this webinar, which is with a lot of learned people. And I should thank Professor Shah for making my introduction so attractive. I felt nice about it. And thank you, Mr. Girish, for covering the LCA guidelines in so much of detail. Honestly, you have been involved quite significantly in that, so it gives us a lot of insights. I'll try to take a little cue from what you have said and then add on more on a general perspective on why the LCA and what are the places where we might have to have, we would be looking at changes or things like that. I've tried to make some notes, so I will try to go about it. IMO 2023 adopted a strategy that they want to bring down the global carbon intensity by 40% by 2030 and try to go to net zero by around 2050. In fact, India is a part of the core member of the zero emission shipping. And one of its mission is to ensure that we are able to put some type of alternate fuel ships on the oceans before 2030 and also encourage the adoption of alternate fuels and zero carbon fuels. Now, both these targets will require significant amount of zero low carbon marine fuels, and the availability, cost, technical feasibility for them to be used on ships is very critical, and it is still in a very nascent stage. Apart from that, to take a few points from what Mr. Girish had said, these fuels need to be sustainable. because they are supposed to be, or they're going to be alternatives to allow the ships to continue to trade. We have been trading, ships have been sailing the seas for so many years. Fossil fuel has been a very sustainable fuel. And now we are trying to replace that with another fuel or fuels which have to be sustainable. I think that is where life cycle assessment has become very essential, because there is a push for another responsibility, that we have to have a fuel that is going to be environmentally responsible, and the maritime industry needs to take on that responsibility along with the other shore-based industries. So that is where life cycle assessment comes in. Now, as shipping companies, or as shipping, we are only end users of the fuels. So we can definitely control and contribute to reduction of GHGs by the tank to wake cycle. That means after I receive a fuel, I should be able to put in technical measures, operational measures, energy management measures, and all these by which I will be able to bring down the reductions from the ship. But there is a critical aspect which has come into being a responsible industry, that is to try to see that we get an input of viable and acceptable fuels which are low in carbon. That is being responsible. So that is the very critical thing, that why we need to do a life cycle analysis of well to tank, so that we know what is the type of fuel that should be used to contribute to decarbonization. So that means indirectly what we are saying is that till now we were responsible for tank to wake on ships, irrespective of how the fuel is coming or what is coming or what negative impacts have been there on how the fuel was manufactured. Now we want to take on the responsibility of seeing that even those areas which were not in our control but can be adapted or taken on board, we would like to be concerned with. That means we don't want to shift anything from we don't want to, misuse the downstream or the upstream. On both sides, we want to show we are responsible. So this is another very important reason why all industries, not only marine, have been trying to go for a life cycle assessment. So that is, if you go through the entire presentation which Mr. Girish has said, he has identified a significant number of things. One of the most important things which he has identified is that unlike a tank to wake cycle, the well to tank cycle is very, very complicated. He has shown us something like 128 pathways by which the fuels can be produced. Low and zero carbon fuels have different production pathways. For example, biofuels, they will have a pathway of cultivation, harvesting, production, storage, distribution, then bunkering, and then use. And similarly, if you go for other type of fuels like ammonia or e-fuels, all these will require an energy production, which again will have another cycle. So there is a significant amount of diverse production pathways that will need to be assessed, and it's a very, very complex path which IMO is now undertaken, and we seem to be making headway. That is one of the reasons why when Mr. Girish identified that there is a significant amount of work left in it, I would say we have done about 30% of the work, because there is a lot of other things that need to be considered before we can have a robust LCA guideline. I will give you a few examples of why we feel it is going to have to need a robust LCA guideline, is because we are talking of a gamut or a territory which is beyond the control of one geographical region. For example, we have fuels, raw material for the fuels being sourced from various locations and being refined in another location. And there is transportation, there is emission of fuels for that raw material, which is, I mean, CO2, which for that raw material which is coming. So it's not just a small, 1 + 1 = 2. It is significant, significantly needs to be evaluated. That brings us to the concept of where do we put a stop to our sustainability criteria. We need to actually try to bifurcate it into a significant number of areas in the well to tank. See, tank to wake, we are in control because once we have the fuel, once we have the equipment to use it, we know how to reduce the emissions. But on the well to tank, there are significant number of processes that will need to be reviewed and clearly identified. I'll give you a thing. Mr. Girish spoke about direct land usage and indirect land usage, and we need to see whether we are actually spoiling the existing carbon dump within the industry, within the earth, or we're actually enhancing it, or we are actually depleting it. So depleting of resources becomes another sustainable aspect. Water. A significant amount of water is going to be used in manufacturing of alternate fuels, or be it energy, be it anything. So we do not want to deplete the water resources, water table. So we possibly will have to use a more abundant thing like seawater, which is again going to become very, very expensive. So now we come to the economic aspects of sustainability, where all this cost of production should be such that it does not move our economic growth in a negative way. And it should not become so expensive that we cannot use it. So there are going to be a lot of options and areas where we need to see. For example, I will tell you on this direct land use and indirect land use. For a country like India, or for a country like Brazil, or for a country like geographically rich in greenery, probably the direct land usage and the indirect land usage would not be as high risk as for a country that is snowbound like in the Europe. And so if they start using their agricultural land to trying to make alternate fuels, they're going to have a high risk of direct land usage or indirect land usage, whereas it may not be the same in our country. So we will need a risk assessment which is based on a regional levels, or a country level, or a geographical level. This is where I think Brazil has been putting a number of proposals onto the table in IMO. And I think there has to be a thing. That is one of the reasons why an expert group has been identified on it. The next point I would look at is, for example, if you look at the US, they are using corn for making biofuel. For them, corn may not be causing a food security hazard. But if we start using palm oil or palm stearine or things like that, which are raw material for making biofuel, if we start using that, we might disrupt our food security system. For example, I will tell you, there are instances where we have an incentive for growing palm oil in India, probably because we wanted to become self-sufficient in palm oil. But there have been instances where rice-rich field has been converted to make palm oil. So we are actually disrupting the food security, which is not a sustainable feature. That is one of the reasons why people talk about sustainability. The other point which Mr. Girish mentioned a lot was about the default values which are being discussed about. Now, default values there could be two types of default values when you are assessing the CO2 emission factors. For example, if I am importing raw material from another country to refine it in my refineries, my process default values will be far significant than somebody who is doing it within their own locality. So a representative default value and a non-representative default value could be very vast. And one of the requirements within the LCA guideline has been identified that we will take a number of default values of representative, non-representative, and use the highest thing. Now, there is a weakness in that entire thing, that if we use the highest one, prospective biofuels or prospective alternate fuels can fail the certification. Because of the default values, they go into high risk of ILUC or high risk of DLUC or direct land usage, or they could also be high risk in other sustainable aspects and may be neglected from certification. So this is another area why we are saying default values should be regionalized, probably localized, regionalized, and then geographically accepted, provided they're all meeting the criteria of the LCA guidelines. Then Mr. Girish spoke about something which is very, very, very challenging. That is certification. When we need to use the fuel certified on a well-to-tank basis, especially with so much of a geographical diverse sources from which it can come and get integrated to form the end product which is going to be used on ships. The next challenge will be to demonstrate that that well-to-tank process, entire chain, value chain, has been evaluated for sustainability. That would mean that the same LCA which we are today looking at, he has identified part A, part B, part C, part D. Probably in that I should look at part A is what he has talked about as well-to-tank. In that part A, there should be, I think, a significant amount of, again, small certifications, like the harvesting time, the CO2 emitted during harvesting time, the CO2 emitted during the production time, the CO2 emitted during the transportation time. So each of these sections may be happening under different responsibilities. So there is going to be a situation where you might have to integrate a number of certifying bodies, each of them certifying it. So that means there'll be a chain of custody. That means somebody has to hand over saying, till this extent, I have certified it's sustainable. And then from here, you take it on. So there will be a chain of custody. Now, who verifies the chain of custody? Who does this? This is where the complexity becomes much more significant. Organizations like ICAO have implemented the life cycle analysis. So it is not that it is a new wheel that we are trying to invent, but they have identified a certain structure. They have not, gone into a stringency of certain extent. They have accepted certain amount of emissions, certain amount of sustainability factors, and they put it in place. So we are trying to use that as a framework and make it more robust. And that is what the LCA guideline is presently being done. Now, there is a thing which Mr. Girish mentioned about various certifying schemes which are available globally. And LCA, IMO has been recommending that we use some of these within the LCA guidelines. There is a concern there because these guidelines or these certifying schemes are using default values and risk assessments based on certain values which they have identified as certification. Now, I gave you two examples of how they can vary from region to region. So there is a debate going on at IMO itself that we should be able to accept equivalent certifications. That means if I have a certification scheme within my country, which is looking at the sustainable factors, which IMO is looking after and feels we are sustainable, we should be able to accept it. So the debate is still on. There is going to be a lot of activity. And I can go on talking about this. It is such an interesting topic, but I think I will stop now. Thank you very much once again. Trust I've been of help. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Kashyap. I think for adding those additional points, not only that, but bringing the problems to the forefront, both in terms of operational point of view and also from what we call actually finding out the correct value for these alternative fuels. So before we take up the questions, I can see there are only two questions in the question answer session, and they are both by Mr. K.K. Palit. Should I read them out or should you unmute Mr. Palit? Dr. Iyengar, which is more convenient? Let me know.
Sir, we can, as we are adding, sir, meanwhile, we can also read out the questions, sir. Meanwhile, we'll try to add Mr. Palit. Yeah, Mr. Palit has come online, sir. You can request him.
So he can put the question straight to Mr. Girish. Okay,
Yes.
that will be much better. Yes, Mr. Palit,
You
please.
can unmute yourself and yeah.
Mr. Palit, you can just put your questions. You can unmute yourself and put the questions. I think he is having a connection problem, so maybe we can just read the question and then.
Mr. Palit, can you hear me?
I think there is a connection problem with Mr. Palit, sir, so perhaps we can read the question and answer. Please.
I think if he gives a message, it will be better. Please explain about the production and storage of nitrous oxide. Will this be alone or with other greenhouse gases? This is the first question by Mr. Palit. Mr. Girish?
Yes, sir. I'll try to explain, answer this question. Because the nitrous oxide is one of the higher global warming potential gases. Yes, into 64 times that of the carbon dioxide. So but this is being produced at the time of combustion of the fuel, either at the time of combustion of some of the fuels, even some fuels which contain nitrogen like ammonia. So there, this kind of nitrous oxide possibility is high. And nitrous oxide, even though it comes only in very small quantity, it will have a big effect on the global warming potential. So we don't store these, they are actually emitted into the, now there is no system of capturing or storing, but it is actually emitted. So we have to see how much nitrous oxide is coming and try to reduce the production of this during the combustion. That's what we'll have to aim at. So it has to be accounted for. That a very small amount, but it has to be accounted for. I hope I have
small amount, but a very important amount.
Important amount. Important.
Because of the high weightage given to this particular thing. The second question from Mr. Palit is like this. Please explain in simple terms what is tank to wake.
Yes, sir. Of course, we have been talking, both of us, Mr. Kashyap also explained a lot of things on tank to wake. So that is what is within the hands of the people who are on board the ship. You get the fuel on board the tank. After bunkering, you get it in the tank, and from there onwards, whatever you do with the fuel, the purpose of combustion, whatever energy we are consuming, all that will go into the emissions. You may have maybe heating the fuel, you may be doing some preparation of the fuel, and then finally combustion of the fuel in the engine. In all these processes, we have got emissions of carbon dioxide, or even some little amount of methane or nitrous oxide, the other GHG gases. So entire whatever is happening on board, as far as emission is concerned, that is covered by the tank to wake. And whatever is happening outside before the fuel comes on board in the well to tank. I hope that is a simple explanation of what is tank to wake. We call it wake because the combustion takes place and then finally it used for propulsion. That's why that wake, because that is what is happening on board the ship. Thank you.
I guess this is the smoke wake rather than the propeller wake. The funnel wake. I guess that is right.
Right,
okay.
Right, sir. You're right. Not the propeller wake. Yeah.
Just let me see. Anything else is there?
Sir, I think Commodore Tatar has put a question in the chat box.
Right. One last question is still there. That is exactly what I was saying. But why we say wake? So I think please answer it again. Why we say wake? Oh, that's right. It's a follow-up question. Okay.
Right. Yeah. As I think my understanding is that what you rightly said, that you have the smoke is coming out, the exhaust gases are coming out. That is a wake. So that in that wake, from the tank to the wake, how much GHG is being emitted? That will be the tank to wake emission.
I would look at it like this. Tank to wake is basically we are converting the energy of fuel which is stored on board the ships to propel the ship forward. So the propeller wake, it's always called the propeller wake with the water is going behind it. So probably that is the reason why they say well to wake.
Yeah, you're right. I think because if you talk about other than combustion, suppose you use a fuel cell or something. So there also you are converting the energy into the propeller.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's
So
probably
there
energy
so much.
conversion.
Yeah. So energy, it's energy conversion, which is a better definition of wake.
It's
Thank you. I think it's a nomenclature. It has just stuck. That's my personal feeling.
That's true.
Dr. Iyengar, yes.
Yes, sir.
Please.
Commodore Tatar has got a question. He's put it in the chat box instead of the Q&A, sir. Perhaps.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I didn't see the chat box.
So I'll. So he
Can
has
I
just
read the
requested to
question?
read out the. He has
I can
requested that
read
we
it
can
out.
read out his. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Please,
I
sir.
can read it out. I have
Yes.
seen the chat
Yes.
box. This is where Commodore. Yeah. Well to tank is extremely critical aspect which both of you have brought out. However, this may not be directly under the purview of the mariners. Is there any effort being made by the maritime fraternity to fuel research in fields other than carbon capture by stakeholders involved in the fossil fuels? This is by Commodore Bhupesh.
Yeah.
Can I just put a
Kashyap, you can answer.
small view on this? The tank to wake emissions, like he said, well to tank emissions, there is not within the control of the mariners. That is 100% sure. So that is when we are only trying to shift the responsibility into the marine side, saying that we will buy fuels which have been evaluated to be of a low carbon. Now there is a significant amount of research going on the other side, where on the agriculture side, in fact, on the shore-based industry, there is a lot of activity going on to see how they could use or reduce the carbon emission in the production of alternate fuels. For example, for ports, ports are using wind energy, solar energy, and we are trying to see whether these things can be used for making of hydrogen. India has got a huge hydrogen mission in place, which hydrogen is going to become a main part of any fuel. If you take ammonia, NH3, and so probably that is where we are doing it. Like I said in the beginning of my talk, that it is very nascent as of now. There is a lot of activity going on. Maybe Girish will be able to tell more on this because he's done a lot of study on this.
Research is happening on hydrogen, usage of hydrogen and ammonia, and mainly on the safety aspects. And then ammonia, for the availability of ammonia is also being studied, and engines are being tested for ammonia. And in fact, there's more or less the testing is done. MAN has already finished their testing, and they're going to produce the first engine. So this kind of study is going on. But as far as fuel research, the fuel itself concerned, okay, the maritime industry may not be much involved in fuel research because there are other stakeholders in the field who are the producers of the fuel, and the refineries or the factories who are producing the fuel, and the biofuels production area. There, I think the maritime industry is not much involved, but in fact, some of these the fossil fuel based refineries and those they are involved in getting into the other kind of renewable fuels. They are also doing some research on that. So such studies are going on where even though the maritime industries are directly involved. And that's my understanding.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think methanol and all also being used.
I can only add one small thing, or just a point out here, that the well to tank is very important for the marine industry, because what progresses there will have a direct impact on us.
Yes.
See, the problem here is that suppose something good comes out of well to tank, are we ready to accept it? Okay, and that's yes, Mr. Girish talked about methanol and ammonia. I'm just giving an idea that whatever research or development takes place under well to tank. Okay, and if significant amount of improvement is found there, that will directly impact also how the marine industry is capable of utilizing it.
Yes.
I think the future regulations will drive improvement in the production technology, because otherwise we won't be able to use those fuels. So the regulations which are trying to reduce the intensity of GHG intensity will be the driver for this kind of industry to improve. So indirectly we are influencing that industry.
Yeah, there is only one drawback which will come in is we will be fighting for the same pie. Where most of the industries are going to look for the same thing. So shipping will also be fighting for the same pie. So it is going to be a huge cost implication initially till we get the viability in place.
Thank you, sir.
As of now, for example, biofuels, we are going to compete with the airline industry. That is for sure. Yes, sir.
This one last, I think, question has come from Captain Neeraj Bharti, who is sailing on ships. That he says, I am sailing master on ships. There are plenty of ships running on methanol, LNG, ammonia to reduce carbon footprint. Also, it is the IMO 2030 agenda to reduce CO2 at sea. It's more of a comment, but I think one of you can just highlight or sort of talk about this or say about it. He's saying already there are a number of ships running with methanol, LNG and ammonia to reduce the carbon footprint, which is leading towards the IMO 2030 agenda.
Yeah, I think methanol, there are many ships which have been at least methanol ready. When methanol is available, they can use it. Methanol is still LNG, of course, it has been there for quite some time. Ammonia is yet to vessels are yet to be run on ammonia. So all this, basically it is the IMO strategy which is driving this agenda, because to meet this such a target, highly ambitious target of reducing the emissions to 30, 40, and 50, and finally reaching net zero. So these targets are driving the agenda. So that way, I agree with him that it's IMO target which will reduce the GHG emissions, and then it will promote the use of this kind of fuels.
Add a little.
Can add, yeah.
Please.
Just want to add a small thing that LNG, methanol, ammonia, all these are not universally being used on all types of ships. For example, LNG, I don't think is being used on a bulk carrier or any other type of a ship because of storage mechanism and things like that. And when we say a lot of ships are running, yes, these are all experimental ships presently running, which we are also, as a ship owning company, we are closely monitoring these things. But one of the positive things in this entire thing is that we have accepted LNG as a possible transition fuel. And IMO has taken on the task of trying to measure the sea slip, which has been one of the most negative aspects of LNG. And when we go into life cycle analysis, if we go back to what Mr. Girish has identified, the well-to-tank emissions of CO2 are 19.8 grams CO2 per megajoule as compared to 16 when it is fossil fuel. So LNG is not a very attractive proposition there. So in a long term, it will not be there, but we want to use this as a transition fuel because we are not going to get the magic portion of fuel with just like that. So we need a transition fuel where we will use biofuels, which have got does not have a very good carbon footprint if we look at the high risk of ILUC and DLUC. But we want to use it for transition. Similarly, methanol, similarly, LNG. All these are coming out with those things. So what Captain Neeraj has identified is absolutely right. But I don't think it is on a scalable limit just now, which we are all looking for. I mean, all of us want something alternate to this. Decarbonizing shipping is mandated.
Thank you. Dr. Bharat, can I take a one more question from Professor Ajit Chennai.
Yes, sir. You can, sir. We have added him to the panel, sir. Perhaps.
You're adding him to the panel, then he can.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. He can ask the question directly, sir.
There is also a question by Mr. Dasgupta, I think, which we didn't answer.
Let it come from Professor Shenoy, and then we can discuss.
Professor Shenoy, perhaps you can just unmute yourself and ask the question, sir.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, thanks to Mr. Girish for a very stimulating presentation of the subject, and that too in a very comprehensive manner. I also found Mr. Kashyap's commentary very informative. My input relates to sustainability as such, which we understand is based on 3 pillars of the environmental, economic, and societal factors. In my view, possibly the easiest criterion to tackle is the environmental one. But for societies like those in India, social and economic factors possibly also should come in and maybe to the fore. So my question to both of you really is, how much is the IMO MEPC able to cope with quantifying the diverse social/economic issues into the final criterion? Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for this question. In fact, so far IMO has not gone into the social and economic factors. IMO has just stopped at maybe environmental factors. If you see the list of items which we aspects which we identify, they are all environmental parameters. But now they have formed another correspondence group which will discuss all the social and economic factors. So the work of this group will be very important for the social and economic factors. So far, IMO has not been focusing on this. They stopped at the environmental factors. And Mr. Kashyap can confirm this.
I think what you said was absolutely right, but there is a couple of things that have triggered this social and economical factors to be brought into the LCA was because when we are trying to implement these midterm measures as a part of the driving force to get in more sustainable fuels, there is a comprehensive impact assessment that is being done, and which takes into consideration a significant amount of social and economic aspects. So it will come into the aspect of life cycle analysis. But to answer Mr. Shenoy, yes, IMO does definitely, I wouldn't say, can drive the social and economic front on a global scale. Probably it will only look at marine fuels, production and sustainability, what type of a social and economic impact it is likely to cause, and see if it can be addressed, which probably I think would be very small compared to the actual production of, if you take the life cycle analysis that is required for an industrially growing country like India, the energy demand would be significant on the shore-based industry, which would cause much more significant social and economic impacts when we start adopting green technology. Thank you.
I think I'm muted. I would just like to add that the IMO has gone in for a comprehensive impact assessment, and what they are looking for is that the midterm measures that they will put in place will have some system, and the countries which are going to get affected by these measures will be compensated in some manner or the other. Okay, that is what they are now looking at, because there will be countries which will be more affected by these measures that are going to come in, and countries which are less. So they are trying to have some sort of a balance by which at least the levy or the fee or the money that is generated is basically going to mitigate some of these economic and societal problems that may arise, but mainly from the marine shipping side. Thank you. Mr. Dasgupta, please.
You can read it out if you, Mr. Girish. Yeah. I sent it to Mr. Girish and a separate one to Mr. Kashyap also. This is regarding how the practical naval architect would be engaging.
Right. Yeah. So that is another aspect which was not directly part of the LCA, but when you have all these fuels coming in, how to design ships for these new fuels, that's a big challenge. Firstly, many of these fuels, they don't have that kind of energy content like other fuels. So definitely we'll have bigger tanks, and the tank space, the fuel tank space will go up. So that may have some effect on the cargo capacity. And then that again depends on what is your bunkering frequency and all that. So all this will have to be thought about when you design the tanks. Secondly, all the safety aspects connected with these fuels. Because then while we look at the environmental factors here, there are a lot of safety aspects which are to be taken into account, which designers will be affected. In fact, IMO, the Maritime Safety Committee side, they are working on those aspects. So we have a lot of things like this gas fuel. Gas fuel, we already have got the IGF code, and they're making the thing. They are also preparing guideline, or some guidelines on hydrogen and ammonia have been prepared. Further work is being done. So when you have all these kind of fuels on board, where to have the tank in a safe location, what kind of risk assessment we have to do, all that they have to take into account, and then ventilation. To prevent such any explosion out of any leakage. So the entire designer will have to think of this propulsion system designer, or the engine, the engine room will have to be designed entirely differently. So all those, considering all the safety aspects, so that would be a big challenge. In fact, but there are a lot of work being done, and rules are being published. In fact, for these kind of guidelines and rules are being published for this taking into account. But they have been updated also as we learn more and more. So this is something which the naval architects will have to keep track of what is happening, and then see they have to improve their designs as the technology progresses, and also new requirements on safety and other things will come in. So it'll be a dynamic situation now for them. That's what
yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you.
It could be one other challenge. It could be one other challenge, Mr. Dasgupta. One is we are going to have multiple types of fuels.
Yes.
So you probably will have to, a lot of naval architect magic will be required to see if a ship can be, changed over in the last minute to a fuel that is usable, because we don't have the engines yet. Today, most of the shipyards are saying ammonia ready or methanol ready, and then suddenly if you find that the engine is not ready, you should be able to change over that to using an alternate fuel. So there is, I think you people will drive, naval architects will drive the innovation that side on the structures. And if you can improve on the hull forms and things like that further and further, because this fuel carriage, energy carriage of these fuels is going to be very, very low compared to what fossil fuels was doing. So we should not affect the speed and quantity as any innovation that can bring down the consumptions, whether it is in fossil fuel or alternate fuels, will help a lot, I think. So there will be a lot of work. Of course, design is your side.
Yeah, if I may come back on this, I think we would need to have a scenario analysis, which is normally done in other industries, addressing the complete shipping industry. Different scenarios as they evolve. Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
I can add here to Dr. Mr. Dasgupta's comment. I think this is already being done. They are in smaller boats like fishing vessels, tugs, and ferries. Most of them are going in for a hybrid concept, and they are looking at how much time it is operating in what mode. And accordingly, the hybrid system is being designed by the naval architects. And this is very crucial. Like we are looking at life cycle there, here also we are looking at a cycle of operation, that it is performing per year. And accordingly, the hybridization system is being done. This I'm mainly saying from electric batteries and what we call fuel cells propulsion point of view. This combination becomes very, very important. That what time it is spending for what purpose, and accordingly design the system and have a switchover like you have for hybrid cars. Have a switchover accordingly so that the minimum amount of fuel is used. I think naval architects have to gear up. There is no other choice.
Yeah.
Mr. Kharagpur has raised his hand, so can you unmute him? And maybe the last, I think, of the lot.
Yeah.
Good evening, everybody.
Thank you.
I compliment Mr. Girish for giving a very comprehensive talk on GHG lifecycle assessment. Actually, I just wanted to give my input with permission of Girish and the session chair and Dr. Iyengar, that I just give an explanation as to Mr. Palit asked how the formation of N2 takes place. That I have given my brief explanation in the note only. That the formation can be explained by Zeldovich or Fenimore mechanism, which perhaps answers Mr. Palit's question. And regarding hydrogen, I think there is HGMF is doing a lot of research on hydrogen as to its viability for alternate fuel. This is just my input with your permission, sir. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
One final observation by Mr. Karan Doshi of IRS. The number of new build orders for methanol fuel ships has just exceeded the number of new build orders for ships filled with LNG. So there is a shift going on. This is an observation from Mr. Karan Doshi.
Wonderful.
Bharadwaj, can I now first of all thank the speaker, Mr. N. Girish, for giving an excellent presentation. Mr. Kashyap for his views and adding up to what Mr. Girish had presented, and to Mr. Jyotishman Dasgupta, Dr. Bharadwaj Iyengar for giving me the opportunity to chair the session, which for me has been a learning process, as normally it is for all teachers. Okay, so I am grateful to all of you that I have spent the time, but I have learned a lot. That much I can be thankful to. So, do I pass it on to Jyotishman?
No, to Bharadwaj.
To Bharadwaj. Okay.
Yeah.
Dr. Bharadwaj, please take over.
Thank you, sir. That was a well-conducted session, sir, with useful comments both in the post-speaking session. My first thanks is to Mr. Kashyap, who has agreed to become the chief guest for today, as well as brought us insights both post the talk as well as during the Q&A discussions later. And Mr. Girish, who had his talk was the foundation for all the discussions today. So it was very informative. As Professor Shah has already told, it is something that all of us learned a lot today. So it will be, I think, one of the very informative lectures by INA, which I should thank Mr. Girish for giving that talk. And Professor Shah, sir, thanks for chairing the session as well as intervening during the Q&A sessions. Very appropriate comments and connect to the Q&A session well, as well as the talk well. And thanks for chairing the session, sir. And Mr. Dasgupta, who was always our support. And without him, these things would not happen. And Mr. Amir. And my primary thanks is to all the audience today. We had 28 audience. And with very insightful comments from the experienced naval architects, Mr. Palit, Professor Shenoy, Mr. Kalgatki, Mr. Neeraj Bharti, Mr. Karan Doshi, all of them made the Q&A session as an actual panel discussion, which is very livelier with comments and appropriate experiences coming in a very complicated and very dynamic topic as evolved during the talk and as told by everybody. So thanks, sir. Thanks for spending the Saturday evening in a very informative way. And thanks for all the INA background support. Amir, who's ensured that the session goes smoothly in spite of his phone internet connection being poor because of wherever he is. So thanks, sir, and thanks for the INA team behind who is always making this a success. Thank you, sir, and we can end the session today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Just one last thing. We need to inform that I think not everyone knows Mr. Kashyap's father was Mr. Gopal Rao. One of the pioneering naval architects of from IIT Kharagpur. So yes, and we are grateful to Mr. Kashyap for agreeing to chair this session. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you, sir.
We have done our training under Mr. Gopal Rao in our third year at Hindustan Shipyard.
Yes. Can I say a few words, sir? I started in the beginning of the session that I have an affinity towards naval architects. I will definitely say it has rubbed on to me from my father. And the passion he used to show to the students when he was teaching naval architect has rubbed on to me when I have a few naval architects here, and I keep, I mean, it is fascinating. That is why I said you have got a lot of activity to do, sir. Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Dr.
yes. Thank you
I
so
feel
much.
honored.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sir. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.
Yes. With the permission of the chief guest on the chair, I request Amit to close the session for the kids.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Amit.